The loud party music pulsed in the room, vibrating in the bones, while laughter echoed in the corners. Lights flashed in shades of blue and gold, illuminating the faces of excited guests, glasses clinking in celebration. In the center of the track, my wife. Her hair shone under the reflection of the chandelier, her dress hugged her body like a second skin, but none of that mattered. What mattered were his hands, firmly on another man's shoulders. His back arched, his eyes closed, a discreet smile on the corner of his lips. The scene unfolded before my eyes like one of those tragedies that we read about in books, but never believe we will experience. Her ex-husband held her with the same confidence as someone who knew he had never lost her, and in that moment, I realized something that ripped my soul from the inside out. She didn't just allow it, she wanted it. She liked it. Her look wasn't one of surprise, it wasn't one of discomfort. It was desire. It was something that, until then, I thought belonged to me. Time seemed to slow down, each movement of that dance becoming a direct blow to my chest. I could hear the beat of the music, but it felt like everything had gone silent. My blood boiled, my vision went dark for an instant, and when I came to, I saw his hand sliding around her waist. She didn't back down. He didn't move away. He showed no hesitation. As if I wasn't there. As if the presence of her own husband was not a relevant factor in that equation of betrayal, in that dirty dance disguised as nostalgia. I waited a moment. Maybe she would look at me. Maybe she remembered who was there. But the seconds dragged by and nothing happened. Then the truth hit me like a punch in the gut, she had already chosen. And it wasn't me. Every beat of my heart sounded like a hammer in my head. As if a black hole had formed inside my chest, sucking away any spark of dignity I still had left. But I wasn't going to stand there, waiting to be reduced to dust. Not after everything we've built together. Not after all the promises exchanged, the sleepless nights planning a future, the dreams shared. And so, without hesitation, without leaving time for regrets or excuses, I made the decision. The entire hall fell silent as my voice echoed. The announcement was dry, direct, a fatal blow to any trace of love that might have remained between us. I want a divorce. Just like that. As if I were announcing that I was going to get another drink. As if he were communicating something trivial. But the weight of those words destroyed any mask of hypocrisy that still remained at that party. Her gaze finally found me. For the first time all night, she looked surprised. As if I had never imagined that I would react that way. As if she was convinced that she could betray me right there, right in front of me, and I would just accept it, passively, humiliated. Her ex-husband was still holding her around the waist, but now his eyes were fixed on me. A half smile on his face. The kind of smile a man gives when he feels like he's won. But he hadn't won. Not yet. Because this wasn't just a story of betrayal. It would no longer be a story of a man who was exchanged and moved on with his head down, crushed by the weight of disloyalty. No. This was just the beginning. The guests were in shock, whispers spread like trails of gunpowder throughout the hall. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others watched with a mixture of fascination and pity. I felt the reactions around me, but all that mattered at that moment was her. His face was an open book of conflicting emotions. Guilt, surprise, maybe even a trace of regret. But there was no love. There was no despair. There was no genuine fear of losing something valuable. And that was the final blow. She could even try to say something, outline a defense, make up an excuse. But there was no excuse. Not after what I saw. Not after what she did. And there, in the middle of that party, while everyone watched without the courage to intervene, I understood something that perhaps had been before me for a long time. Betrayal doesn't happen the moment someone crosses the line. It happens much earlier. In stolen glances, in hidden conversations, in deleted messages, in poorly explained excuses. She had already cheated on me long before that night. I was just stupid enough not to notice. But if she thought her new choice would lead to a better life, that she was trading stability for a love reborn from the ashes of the past, she was terribly mistaken. Life has a cruel way of repaying those who throw away the priceless. Because fate may even allow you to play with someone's heart, but the bill always arrives. Always. And when it arrives, it comes heavy. Heavier than anyone is prepared to bear. And her? She would pay for this. Sooner than I imagined. But the most ironic of all, what would really make this story unforgettable, wouldn't just be the price it would pay. That would be the way everything would happen. The way fate would play cards she never saw coming. Because while she danced with her ex-husband that night, believing she was experiencing a moment of triumph, of liberation, she had no idea what would come next. I had no idea how much I was about to lose. And when everything came crashing down on her, when every wrong choice came back to haunt her, I would be there. Not to rebuild it. But to watch. To see the exact moment when she would understand that some betrayals have no return. That some choices simply cannot be unmade. The problem with destroying someone who really loved you is that, when everything falls apart around you, that person will be the only one who could save you. But me? I was already gone. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but the moral is real. Betrayal destroys lives, causes irreversible scars and always exacts a high price. Get ready for a shocking story, full of twists, where the truth always comes to light. Now, listen carefully, because some choices can never be unmade. The room sparkled under the yellow light of the chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, reflecting on raised glasses and well-rehearsed smiles. The atmosphere was sophisticated, the guests dressed to the nines, the music filling the space with vibrant harmony. Between muffled laughter and conversations amid toasts, Thomas observed everything with that meticulous look, absorbing every detail as if he could predict every movement before it even happened. He wasn't the type of man to get carried away by the euphoria of a party, but that night, the occasion demanded that he be present. At his side, Lauren, his wife, shone like a polished jewel, dressed in an elegant long dress, her hair tied in a bun that highlighted her impeccable posture. She was the type of woman who attracted attention without having to try. There was something about his presence that made everyone around him notice his existence, a discreet but undeniable magnetism. Thomas and Lauren had been married for 5 years. It wasn't a perfect marriage, but it also wasn't the type of relationship that was overflowing with conflict or obvious bitterness. They had built a comfortable life together, balancing routines, careers, and expectations. Thomas was a businessman, meticulous and disciplined, always concerned with keeping everything under control. I didn't like surprises. He liked predictability, stability, knowing that life went exactly as he planned. Lauren, on the other hand, was a more free-spirited woman, but over the years, she adapted to her husband's calculated rhythm. They had their moments of complicity, the dinners shared after long days of work, the trips planned months in advance, the morning kisses that, although they became a mechanical habit, still carried the feeling of mutual commitment. She used to say she loved the way Thomas made her feel safe. And he believed it. Always believed. After all, a marriage was not just made of overwhelming passion, but of a solid construction, brick by brick, based on respect and trust. And, even though the sparks at the beginning had calmed down, even though the touches were less frequent and the words more economical, he never doubted that Lauren was there by choice, that everything between them was real. That night's party was an event at the company where Thomas worked, a large annual meeting where executives, shareholders, and their companions gathered over glasses of wine and calculated conversations. It wasn't an environment where Lauren felt completely comfortable, but she knew how to play the game. He knew how to smile at the right moments, ask interesting questions, laugh at the lame jokes that guests told to appear witty. She played her role as an exemplary wife to perfection. But that night, there was something different about her. Thomas noticed as soon as they arrived. It wasn't an obvious difference, but small details caught his attention. The way his eyes moved around the room, as if searching for something specific. The restless touch of his fingers on his own wrist, the way he tilted his head at random moments, as if he was waiting for something to happen. He didn't mention anything. Just watched. Over the years, he learned that silences often said more than words. And, contrary to what many imagined, Thomas was not a man who simply ignored the signs around him. He understood the nuances, even if he preferred not to react immediately. The waiter came by offering another round of champagne and Lauren took a glass without hesitation, lifting the crystal to her lips with a lightness that Thomas had always admired. She drank as if there was no rush, as if she could savor every drop and make time slow down just for the pleasure of a well-enjoyed sip. When he lowered the glass, his eyes fixed on a specific point in the room. Thomas followed her gaze and felt an immediate discomfort, as if an alarm had sounded in some corner of his mind. There, just a few meters away, was Daniel. Her ex-husband. He was talking to a group of people, holding a glass of whiskey with the same confident posture as always. Thomas already knew him by sight, although they had never exchanged more than formal greetings on occasions where their presence was inevitable. Daniel was a man who carried an aura of natural charisma. He had the kind of smile that made any conversation seem engaging, a presence that easily captured attention. He was the kind of man Thomas despised, not because of any insecurity, but because of the way he always seemed too comfortable, as if the world around him was a stage made for him to shine. Lauren quickly looked away and moistened her lips, as if trying to hide any expression that might give something away. But Thomas saw it. And in that instant, a shadow of uneasiness fell over him. It wasn't jealousy. He was never a jealous man. It was something else. Something I still didn't know how to name. The rest of the night passed with expected predictability. Trivial conversations, forced laughter, toasts that meant nothing. Thomas continued to watch. Lauren continued to pretend not to notice. But there was something in the air. Something unspoken, something latent, something that seemed to grow every minute. It was when the music started playing and the room filled with couples ready to enjoy the dance floor that everything started to change. The singer's voice filled the space with a soft, inviting melody. Thomas wasn't the dancing type, but he knew Lauren loved it. So when he saw Daniel approach with that casual smile, something inside him lit up like a spark about to turn into a fire. He didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. The gesture said it all. The silent invitation, the outstretched hand, the expectant look. But what really mattered was not Daniel's attitude. What mattered was Lauren's response. The moment of hesitation. The brief look away towards Thomas, as if expecting some reaction. And then, the decision. The moment she accepted her ex-husband's hand and walked to the dance floor without looking back. It was at that very second that something inside Thomas began to break. Slowly. Silently. But irreversibly. The music flowed through the room with an almost hypnotic smoothness, the soft chords filling the space between the scattered conversations. Thomas remained motionless, the glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand, his fingers gripping the glass with unnecessary force. His vision was fixed on the dance floor, where Lauren and Daniel glided in an almost rehearsed way, as if that moment was already destined to happen even before they met again at that party. She was smiling, and it was a smile Thomas hadn't seen in a long time. Not a polite smile, not a calculated smile, but something genuine, something that came from within, as if she had found a piece of herself that had been left behind. Her gaze flickered to Daniel, shining in a way that Thomas recognized. He had seen that expression before, in the early years of their marriage, when she had looked at him adoringly, when there had been that childlike glow of discovery and fascination. But now, that look wasn't for him. With each synchronized step, each gentle turn, Lauren seemed to detach herself from the world around her, and that included her own husband. Thomas felt a pressure in his chest, something slow, corrosive, like a crack spreading from the inside out. He couldn't look away, as if he were stuck in a scene from a movie he hadn't chosen to watch but couldn't get out of. The dance continued, and everything around seemed to dissolve. The whispers among the guests, the furtive glances, the atmosphere charged with something that couldn't be named. Time seemed to have a new rhythm, a different tempo than the rest of the night. The contact between Lauren and Daniel went beyond what was allowed for a simple dance between acquaintances. The touches took longer, the bodies were closer than they should have been. Thomas saw it, but refused to react. Not yet. I still needed to understand how far this would go. When the song finally ended, applause spread throughout the hall. Lauren laughed, throwing her head back slightly, and Daniel whispered something in her ear. She touched his arm, an almost imperceptible gesture, but it made something inside Thomas break once and for all. He knew how to recognize the touch of an interested woman. He knew how to differentiate a casual contact from a touch full of ulterior motives. And that was no coincidence. That was a gesture from someone who, for a brief moment, forgot who was there watching. Thomas downed a shot of whiskey at once, feeling the liquid burn his throat, but not as strong as the sensation of witnessing something that was already beyond his control. He needed to get out of there. I needed to breathe, get my ideas in place. Deep down, a part of him was still trying to rationalize, still trying to find explanations that would alleviate that suffocating feeling that something was about to fall apart. But another part, more instinctive, more primitive, I already knew. I always knew. From the moment Daniel showed up at that party, from the moment Lauren's eyes met him, something was already decided. He walked away from the hall, walking to the balcony, feeling the cool air against his skin. Outside, the city stretched out in flashing lights, cars gliding along the avenues, lives moving at their own pace, completely oblivious to the silent chaos that was beginning to form within. He leaned against the railing and closed his eyes for a moment. But he couldn't find relief. Because when he opened his eyes again, he saw the reflection in the glass of the door that led to the lounge. And he saw Lauren and Daniel leaving together, walking toward the opposite side of the party, away from the dance floor, away from watchful eyes, away from where they should be. Thomas didn't think. Just followed. He moved automatically, without even worrying about appearing discreet. His pulse pounded in his ears, the weight of each step echoing inside him. They didn't realize they were being followed, too busy in the conversation that seemed to take place in whispers, in contained laughter. The corridor where they entered was less busy, an area reserved for employees, away from the main hustle and bustle. Thomas stopped before the bend, leaning against the wall. I could hear their voices, their low tones, intimate, almost complicit. Daniel talked about the past, about how certain things never changed. Lauren laughed, that soft laugh that made her chest tighten. And then he heard something that made his breath hitch. Her voice, hesitant, but filled with an emotion he didn't want to decipher. "Do you still think about me?" Silence. Then Daniel's answer came, firm, without hesitation. "Every day." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, as if he could protect himself from the pain it caused. But the worst was yet to come. One movement. A sigh. A kiss. I didn't need to see it to know. He didn't need to confirm it with his own eyes. The sound of her body pressing against the wall, the brief hitch of breaths, the silence that said it all. He turned the corner, and there it was. What was once just a suspicion now became evidence that was impossible to ignore. Lauren was against the wall, Daniel leaning over her, their lips pressed together in a kiss that wasn't an innocent reunion. It was a kiss from someone who never stopped belonging to the other. The pain came like a physical blow. As if someone had ripped something out of him without anesthesia, without warning. Lauren opened her eyes when she felt the presence, and what she saw on Thomas's face made the blood drain from her face. Daniel walked away slowly, without rushing, as if that moment was just inevitable. Thomas didn't say anything. Because there was nothing to be said. She had already chosen. And in that moment, he realized that the worst kind of betrayal isn't just the physical one. It's one that happens in the mind, long before the body acts. And Lauren had already cheated a lot before that kiss. He was just the last to notice. But what she didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Because betrayal always takes its toll. And she would find out in the worst way possible. Silence weighed like lead in the air. The hallway seemed to have narrowed, compressing the space between the three. Lauren was still leaning against the wall, her lips parted, her breathing uneven. Daniel, beside her, maintained a firm posture, his eyes fixed on Thomas with an expression that oscillated between provocation and indifference. But she was the one who caught the most attention. The face, previously flushed from the heat of the moment, was now pale. It wasn't the embarrassment of someone caught in a forbidden act, it was something deeper. A fear that I couldn't disguise. Thomas didn't move. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but on the outside, he was still. He was not a man who gave in to outbursts of rage, he never was. But this wasn't just anger. It was something much bigger. It was an internal collapse, an implosion that devastated everything he believed he knew. The betrayal was there, wide open, as clear as the light that shone from the ceiling chandelier. But something inside him told him that wasn't all. There was something bigger, something that was behind this moment, something he still didn't understand. And that's what he wanted to find out. Lauren tried to speak, but her voice broke on the first try. He cleared his throat, straightened his posture, as if he could reverse the situation with a convincing explanation. But there was not enough justification to erase what had already been seen. "Thomas, it's not what it seems," she said, hesitantly, and that was enough for him to let out a dry, incredulous laugh, without a hint of humor. "Isn't it what it seems?" he repeated, crossing his arms, as if he were analyzing a poorly rehearsed pathetic piece of theater. "Because from my angle, it looks exactly what it is." Daniel remained silent, observing the scene like a privileged spectator, someone who already knew the outcome before it even began. It was this detail that bothered Thomas. The calmness of Lauren's ex-husband, the absence of guilt, the look of someone who has always been in control. And then, suddenly, it all made sense. How long? The question came out of Thomas's mouth more like a warning than a genuine doubt. Lauren looked away, her fingers clenched on her arm. He felt his stomach drop. "If you lie to me now, Lauren, if you dare tell me anything other than the truth, I swear you'll never see me again." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to say something that could no longer be hidden. When he opened his mouth, his voice was low but sharp. 6 months. It was like being punched in the chest. Not because it was unexpected, but because hearing confirmation of the betrayal made it all real. 6 months. Half a year. All this time, he had lived a lie, sharing a bed with a woman who no longer belonged to him. Every gesture of affection, every look, every word spoken in the last 6 months now seemed like an empty echo, meaningless. But it wasn't just that. There was something beyond. He saw it in her eyes, in her hesitation, in her fear. And that was where the real secret lay. Silence dragged on between them, thick, crushing. And then, he realized. The betrayal wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what made Lauren's hands shake or what kept Daniel so confident. It was something bigger. "There's something you haven't told me yet," Thomas said, his voice firm, and Lauren swallowed hard, hesitating a moment too long. Daniel then let out a sigh, as if he was tired of the whole act. It was he who decided to break the last remaining thread of illusion. "She never loved you, Thomas." The words were like sharp blades cutting into the skin. "You were always a convenient choice, a safe haven. But it was never you. It never could be." The world seemed to spin. Thomas looked at Lauren, hoping she would deny it, hoping that, at least for that moment, she would try to fix it. But all he found was silence. There was no refutation, there was no revolt. Just acceptance. The truth was there, explicit. And suddenly, All the years together, all the memories, everything they had built together, meant absolutely nothing. He took a step back, as if he needed more room to breathe. The air felt heavy, every muscle in his body tense, ready to give way under the weight of this revelation. So that was it. He never had Lauren. Not for an instant. He was just a substitute, a plan B, a mistake that dragged on for too long. What came next? What does someone do when they discover that their entire life with someone was a sham? He didn't know. I just knew I needed to get out of there. He hated the idea of giving them a taste of his fragility, of showing himself destroyed in front of those who didn't deserve to see him like that. But at the same time, I knew this was the time to go. There was nothing more to be said. There was nothing left to be saved. Thomas took a deep breath and looked at Lauren one last time. This time, there was no pain. There was no pleading. Just an irreversible void. You deserve each other. And then he turned his back, leaving behind not just the party, but the entire life he once thought was his. The way out seemed longer than usual. The sound of music still resonated in the background, like a cruel reminder of the life that continued without pause, without regard for his suffering. He crossed the room without looking at anyone, ignoring the curious looks, the inevitable whispers. It didn't matter anymore. None of that mattered. When he finally reached the exit, the cool air hit his face, but it brought no relief. He closed his eyes, trying to process everything. But nothing would make it hurt less. The only thing he knew was that, from that moment on, he would never be the same. The night was advancing outside, but to Thomas, time seemed to have stopped. The early morning cold bit the skin, but it wasn't enough to awaken any real sensation, not after what had just happened. He walked aimlessly through the streets, his steps heavy, his mind spinning in circles, trying to find some answer that made sense. But there wasn't. There was no justification, no reason that would lessen the weight of what he had just discovered. Every memory now felt like a poison, an open wound, every laugh, every touch, every word spoken over the years were just fragments of a lie he never realized. Lauren never loved him. Never. The whole time, he had just been a substitute, someone who was there to fill an empty space, a place where Daniel always reigned, even in his absence. The city lights created distorted shadows around him, reflecting his own inner confusion. He didn't want to go home. What was there for him now? The sofa where they talked about the future, the table where they shared dinners, the room where they believed they shared more than just a space. Everything now seemed dirty, contaminated by the truth that could not be erased. He needed to get out of there. I needed air, I needed a new beginning. But what did it mean to start over when everything he knew, everything he had built, had been based on a lie? He continued walking until he found a random bar, one of those places where no one asked questions, where people drank not to celebrate, but to forget. He sat at the counter, ordering a strong drink, something that would numb that insistent pain that wouldn't let up. The bartender looked at him for a moment, assessing his condition, but said nothing. He just poured the glass and went about his work, as if he understood that there were certain types of suffering that didn't need to be questioned. Thomas took the glass and swirled the liquid around for a moment before drinking it. The alcohol burned his throat, but not enough. Nothing seemed enough. He looked around, observing the few people scattered around the place. There was a woman sitting alone in a corner, playing on her cell phone, a couple arguing quietly at a nearby table, a middle-aged man drinking slowly, his eyes lost in space. Everyone there seemed to carry their own ghosts, their own burdens. It was a relief to know that, at least in this place, no one expected him to pretend to be okay. Minutes passed, maybe hours, and Thomas no longer counted how many drinks he had had. The weight of the night was beginning to fall on him, and the silence of his own mind was a deafening scream. He thought about what would come next. Divorce was obvious, inevitable, but it wasn't just that. It wasn't just about ending a marriage, but about accepting that the person he trusted most was never who he thought he was. It was realizing that, all this time, he was the only one investing in something that was never real. Movement at the bar's entrance caught his attention. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The familiar scent reached him even before the hesitant voice broke the silence beside him. Thomas, Lauren. He closed his eyes for a moment before slowly turning around. She was there, standing next to him, her eyes filled with a weight that now meant nothing to him. What did she expect to find there? Forgiveness? Understanding? Any chance of justifying what you did? Did you follow me? His voice was cold, emotionless. She hesitated before sitting next to him, asking for a glass of water. The bartender looked at her and then at Thomas, assessing the situation, but again, said nothing. I needed to talk to you, Lauren began, her voice almost shaking, but Thomas showed no reaction. This can't be how it ends. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. How exactly did you think this would end? With a hug? With me understanding that you needed to go back to him because love never died? Because if so, spare me. Lauren lowered her head, moving her hands on the counter, a gesture he once found charming, but now only saw as a reflection of the guilt she carried too late. I didn't plan this, she whispered, and that was the last straw for him. Didn't you plan? He turned completely to her, his eyes hard, without any trace of the man who once looked at her with love. 6 months, Lauren. 6 months of lies. Don't tell me it was an accident, that you tripped and fell straight into his arms. She swallowed hard, her eyes shining with something he refused to identify. I tried. I tried to love you. I tried to move on. But it was never the same. The final blow. He nodded, as if he finally understood the full extent of his position in this story. So that's it. I was the substitute. The spare tire while it was unavailable. She didn't respond. Because there was nothing else to answer. And that hurt more than any answer she could give. Thomas stood up, throwing some bills on the counter before grabbing his coat. You got what you wanted, Lauren. You can go back to him now. Just don't expect me to look at you again. He left the bar without looking back, leaving her behind, leaving everything behind. And for the first time that night, he realized that despite the pain, there was something there that he hadn't yet considered. Freedom. Because, in the end, he wasn't the man who lost. He was the man who finally broke free. The street was silent, interrupted only by the distant sound of a car's tires slowly passing by. The cold wind bit his skin, but Thomas felt nothing but the crushing weight of disappointment. He walked aimlessly, each step echoing in the emptiness of a night that seemed to drag on without end. The city around him continued its listless cycle, streetlights flickering at regular intervals, closed shop windows reflecting a face he barely recognized. His world had collapsed and yet the rest of his life continued intact, as if nothing had happened. This irritated him. The fact that his suffering was so personal, so internal, so insignificant to everything else. Lauren's words still echoed in her mind, repeating like a broken record. I tried to love you. What kind of sentence was that? How did anyone try to love another human being? Love was not something that was forced, it was not an experiment, it was not an obligation. Love was genuine or it was nothing. But for her, for that woman he dedicated years of his life to, everything seemed to have been a failed attempt to fit him into a space where he never belonged. The conclusion was simple and devastating at the same time, he was never enough. He continued walking until he realized he had stopped in front of his own house. The facade, once welcoming, now seemed just an empty shell, a theater set up to cover up a lie that had lasted too long. He opened the door slowly, the sound echoing in the absolute silence inside. The furniture was in the same place, the pictures on the wall were still aligned, the decoration was impeccable. But now it was all just a soulless scenario, without any meaning. The room where they watched movies together, the sofa where they fell asleep so many times, the table where they ate dinner under the dim light of the lamp, everything had been just a stage for something that was never real. He climbed the stairs slowly, his steps heavy, feeling each step creak beneath his feet. When he arrived at the room, he stopped at the door for a moment, observing the environment with different eyes. Her scent was still there, permeating the sheets, the clothes thrown on the armchair, the meticulously organized dressing table. A day before, that room was a shared space, a symbol of what he believed his life to be. Now it was just a cold room, a purposeless space. He entered and went straight to the closet. He opened the doors and began to pick up his things, throwing them into a suitcase without the slightest concern for organization. I didn't want to stay there for another night. I couldn't bear to breathe the same air, see the same objects that had suddenly lost all meaning. As he was closing his suitcase, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He picked up the device without much interest, already expecting some useless message from someone who probably didn't know what had happened. But when he saw the name on the screen, he felt something different. Lauren. He stared at the screen for a few seconds before swiping to answer. The silence on the other side was the first sign that she was hesitating. Then her voice came, low, filled with something he didn't know if it was regret or just tiredness. Did you go home? The question came out as a whisper, as if she already knew the answer but needed to confirm it. Thomas didn't respond immediately, feeling a contained anger rising in his chest. The audacity of asking something so trivial, after everything that had happened, was almost an insult. Why are you calling me, Lauren? Her voice was cold, distant, as if she no longer recognized the woman on the other end of the line. She sighed, and he imagined she was in some secluded corner, perhaps sitting on a couch, holding the phone in both hands, like she always did when she was nervous. But why did he still know these things? Why did I still know his habits, his gestures, his insecurities? It shouldn't matter anymore. I just wanted to know if you were okay, she said, and he let out a dry, disbelieving laugh. Me being okay is a detail that never mattered to you before. So why now? The question hung in the air, hovering between them, and for the first time, Lauren didn't have an immediate answer. Thomas waited. I wanted to hear something that explained what was going on inside her mind, that shed some light on all the chaos she caused. But all that came was silence. There was no possible justification. There were no words that would fix what was broken. And at that moment, he realized he didn't want to hear anything anymore. I didn't want explanations. He no longer wanted to carry the burden of understanding someone who never did the same for him. Don't call me again, Lauren. This is over, he said, emotionless, and hung up before she could respond. He threw his cell phone on the bed and ran his hands over his face, feeling the weight of accumulated fatigue. But it wasn't just physical. It was mental. It was emotional. It was the kind of exhaustion that came when you realized that an entire chapter of your life had been written on torn pages. But there was one thing Lauren didn't know, something that would ultimately be the biggest blow to her. Thomas was not a man who stayed in the past. He wouldn't be the one to spend months or years dwelling on what happened. He was not a ghost haunting history itself. He took a deep breath and picked up his suitcase, walking out of the room without looking back. He closed the door of the house, certain that he would not return. Not there. Not for that life. The path to the car was different this time. It wasn't a defeated man who left there. He was someone who had just freed himself from an invisible chain that held him back. He could rebuild everything. She could finally be free to find something she never had with her, true love. And as he drove away, a certainty grew within him. Lauren still didn't know the price she would pay for her choices. But destiny had already begun to take its toll. The road stretched ahead, the pre-dawn darkness making each mile an empty canvas for his thoughts. Thomas drove slowly, the gentle roar of the engine filling the silence that was now part of him. I didn't look back, I didn't think about going back, I no longer felt that suffocating need for answers. Everything he needed to know had already been said, and what was left was emptiness. But even emptiness was better than the lie he had lived for so long. The car advanced, cutting through the night, taking with it the last remnants of the man he once was. The one who trusted. The one who believed. The one who one day looked at Lauren and saw her future. The phone rang once again in the passenger seat, her name flashing on the screen. Thomas didn't answer. He knew what would come next. Words that meant nothing, apologies that didn't erase the facts, attempts to rewrite the story that had already been told. He didn't want to hear her voice, he didn't want to know where she was, what she was feeling, what had happened after he left the bar. The cycle closed the moment he walked through that door. Now, he was just a man driving away, without a clear destination, but with the certainty that he would never return to where he came from. He continued forward until he found a roadside motel, one of those that exuded a smell of loneliness permeated through the aged furniture. The receptionist, a tired-looking man, didn't ask any questions. He just took the documents, entered some information into the old system and handed over the room key. Thomas walked up the stairs, the deserted hallway echoing his footsteps. Upon entering, he threw his suitcase in the corner, sat on the edge of the bed and stared into space. For a moment, reality weighed on us in an almost unbearable way. The betrayal, the humiliation, the crushing truth that his entire life with Lauren was nothing more than a well-crafted illusion. But he wouldn't allow himself to fall apart. No more. Sleep didn't come easily. He closed his eyes and saw the scene repeating itself, like a movie he couldn't escape. The dance. Her look. The touch. The kiss. The silence carried a meaning that he only understood too late. But it wasn't just that. It was everything that came before. The little signs he ignored. The absences. The empty answers. The distance he tried to fill without realizing it never wanted to be filled. He forced himself to take a deep breath, to push those thoughts out of him. The past was already over. Now he was just a man in a motel room, starting from scratch. The next morning, the weak sunlight filtered through the curtains, bringing a new day that, to him, didn't seem so different from the previous one. He got up, took a quick shower and decided he wouldn't stay there for long. He needed to go somewhere where he could reorganize his life, where he could figure out what he was going to do from now on. But before he could leave, an unexpected sound came from the door. 3 dry, hesitant knocks. His body went rigid. Few people knew where he was. And only one could be foolish enough to look for him there. He opened the door slowly, and there she was. Lauren. The swollen eyes, the messy hair, the expression of someone who hasn't slept all night. She seemed smaller, more fragile, as if the weight of guilt was beginning to crush her. But Thomas felt no compassion. He didn't feel anything. He just watched her for a few seconds, before finally speaking, his voice emotionless. "How did you find me?" She pressed her lips together, as if she needed the strength to respond. "It wasn't hard. I knew you wouldn't stay home. And I also knew you wouldn't get very far." He let out a sigh, crossing his arms. "Now what? What do you want, Lauren?" She lowered her head, took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to say what she came to say. "I needed to see you. I needed to explain." "Explain?" He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "There's nothing left to explain. You chose what you wanted. And now why are you here? Out of regret? Because you realized he wasn't what you thought he was?" She looked up, and he saw tears forming in her eyes. But he didn't care anymore. "I wouldn't fall into that emotional trap again. I never wanted to hurt you, Thomas. I did everything wrong, but I never wanted it to end like this." "But it's over," he replied, firmly. "And you need to accept that." She hesitated, her lips trembling. Do you hate me? He was silent for a few seconds, thinking about that question. No, he didn't hate her. Hatred demanded a type of emotion he no longer felt for her. What was between them now was just a vacuum. A hole that nothing could fill. No, he finally said. But I also don't care anymore. Her expression broke in that instant. It was as if those words were the final blow, more painful than any scream, any insult. Because it was true. He didn't care anymore. I didn't want to save her anymore. I didn't want to know how she felt anymore. She took a step back, her eyes watering. I just wish things were different. He nodded, with a serenity that surprised even himself. I wanted to too. But some things can't be fixed, Lauren. She stared at him for a moment longer, waiting for him to say something, to give any indication that there was hope. But he didn't say anything. He just watched as she took another step back, then another, until she finally turned and walked away. Thomas closed the door, feeling a strange relief. Not because it was easy, but because it was finally over. He picked up his suitcase, left the room and went downstairs without looking back. There was nothing left there for him. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was free to start over. Time passed slowly, as if it were testing Thomas's limits, forcing him to face every second of his new reality without Lauren. But, unlike what he might have expected, he didn't feel the crushing pain he imagined he would carry forever. In the beginning, there was a kind of emptiness, a lingering echo of the past trying to find you at random moments. The smell of coffee in the morning, the sheets arranged in a specific way, a feminine laugh on some busy street that made him turn his head only to realize it wasn't her. But then, her absence began to turn into something liberating. For the first time, he no longer needed to live in the shadow of false love, he no longer needed to be the man who tried to fill a space that was never his. Now, it was just him and a new path ahead of him, with no one dictating how it should be or feel. He moved to a smaller apartment, a simple but comfortable place. I didn't want to be surrounded by memories anymore, I didn't want a space that was too big for just one person. The divorce process was quick, without major disputes. Lauren seemed to accept the outcome, perhaps because she knew she had nothing left to gain or perhaps because, deep down, she understood that losing Thomas was just an inevitable consequence of the choices she made. He didn't ask. I didn't want to know how she was dealing with everything. She followed her life, and he followed his. But the irony of fate is that the freedom she sought so much alongside Daniel did not come in the way she imagined. Her ex-husband, who was once the great unfinished love of her life, turned out to be very different from the man she idealized in her mind. At first, there was the euphoria of reunion, the feeling that they were finally where they were supposed to be. But Daniel was never a man of commitments, he never knew how to stick with something for a long time without getting bored. What seemed like a burning passion quickly turned into something suffocating, unstable. The same charms that made him irresistible to Lauren were the ones that made him lose interest. He no longer needed to win her over, there were no more challenges, just the inevitable routine that one day made him leave her before. And, just like before, he left her again. No big explanations, no remorse, no looking back. It was only then that Lauren felt the true weight of her choices. Without Thomas, without Daniel, without the life he believed he would have. She didn't just miss one wedding. She has lost the respect she once had for herself. He lost the security he despised, exchanging it for an illusion that crumbled before his eyes. The people around her no longer looked at her the same way. Friends who had previously admired them as a couple now viewed her with looks of judgment or pity. Her image was tarnished, and no matter how many times she tried to justify to herself that she followed her heart, in the end, all that was left was regret. But regret does not remake choices. Regret only haunts us for what has already been lost. Thomas, on the other hand, wasn't looking back. He was tired of carrying pain that wasn't his. If before he sought to understand, now he just accepted that some things just happen and that the only real choice we have is how we move on afterwards. He rediscovered his worth, rebuilt his confidence, and, over time, found something he never thought possible: new love. It was neither immediate nor forced. It happened naturally, when I least expected it, with someone who didn't need to be convinced to stay. With someone who looked at him the way he deserved to be looked at. Without doubts, without hesitations. For the first time in a long time, he felt complete, not because someone else filled an empty space, but because he himself learned to be enough. Time continued to follow its course. The scars remained, but not as open wounds, but as marks that remind him of a past that no longer has power over him. Lauren moved on with her life, but the regret never went away. Because the worst punishment for someone who cheats is not being hated. It's being forgotten. And Thomas forgot her. The man who was once willing to do everything for her now didn't even think about her. And that was something she would have to carry alone. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Do you think Thomas made the right decision by moving forward without looking back? Leave your opinion in the comments. Your vision is important. And if you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. Remember, we do not support any type of betrayal here. Until next time.